Welcome back to the channel, guys, and today we're going to talk about why laziness is infinite. In fact, it's one of the two infinite forces in the universe, in the human psyche. I was recently thinking about human behavior, and I've realized that laziness and greed are two extremes of the same spectrum. In this video, we'll mostly focus on laziness, but let me just explain what I mean. There is no limit to laziness. There's basically no limit to how lazy people can get. If you think that you've become a lazy person, trust me, there's still more room to get even more lazy. If you think that somebody's lazy because they don't put the dishes in the dishwasher after work, well, that's really just the beginning. You can get infinitely more lazy. There are literally people who are completely unemployed that have nothing to do all day and they're still lazy. They still would not get off their couch and simply clean their room. Laziness is almost this hidden force that has absolutely no limit. If you give people a choice, they will always choose an option with the least amount of work. And this is the evolutionary principle. That's what I say. This is one of the two fundamental forces in the human psyche. Laziness, because what is laziness at its core? It's the conservation of resources. Why would I work more than I should? Why would I do more work than I should? In fact, there's nothing wrong with being lazy if the extra effort doesn't bring an additional amount of reward. And that's how we were basically programmed by evolution. So I'm not really criticizing laziness in this video, it's more of a discussion. I've just noticed this interesting phenomenon. It's actually a biological process to preserve glucose in your brain that sort of leads to quote-unquote laziness. People's brains run on sugar or glucose, and right now there's nearly an unlimited amount of sugar. You can just gorge on candy and you can just buy 5 pounds of sugar for like $2. So there's no limit of sugar. However, that's in our modern civilization, which is a complete anomaly. However, that was not the case at all for the most part of human history. Before civilization, it was extremely hard to find sugar. In fact, in some areas, almost impossible. Just try to go in a local forest and find anything eatable with carbs. Therefore, this preservation of energy, particularly sugar, is hardwired in our DNA. It's only after we invented agriculture, sugars and carbs became readily available. However, civilization only emerged in the last 5,000 years, but anatomically modern humans existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and pre-humans existed for millions of years. So this process, this evolutionary process of preserving glucose, preserving sugar, is hardwired in our DNA. In other words, humans are evolutionarily hardwired. They're biologically hardwired to preserve energy, and doing anything requires extra energy. In fact, doing extra thinking requires additional sugar. Even when you have to think about something hard, it requires more glucose resources. So when you have to think really hard, when you have to solve a complex problem, your brain uses more glucose. It uses up glucose stores in your body. So it is actually resource intensive to think hard about something. So that's why some people are so lazy. They don't even want to think. People would just rather ask ChatGPT to think for them, and it all stems from the same evolutionary principle of preservation of resources, preservation of glucose. So that explains laziness. That's why it's one of the two fundamental forces in the human psyche. So many products are created because people are lazy. So many people got rich of selling products that save 2 seconds in your daily routine. Many people became millionaires of people's laziness because this is a bottomless pit. Human laziness is a bottomless pit because humans are optimized to preserve resources. In that sense, there's nothing wrong with laziness. In fact, you could argue that there is really nothing wrong with anything unless you're harming somebody. So laziness can be functional. It's a normal until it becomes harmful to yourself or to somebody else. And that's when it becomes a problem. However, humans are basically hardwired biologically to be lazy. It's almost like gravity. Humans are always pulled downward into doing nothing. And in fact, there's some research that hunter-gatherers were mostly just doing nothing their entire day. You might think that they were foraging and hunting for food all day, but in fact, the food was pretty easily available. Pre-civilization, you could just go in a local forest, go to a nearby forest, just gather some berries. According to some research, food was wildly available pre-civilization. So most of the day, people were just doing nothing, literally sitting by the fire and just chatting. Obviously, we'll never really know, but that's one of the predominant theories. Just because people couldn't grow wheat doesn't mean they were starving. It just meant that there was a limited amount of people that a set amount of food could sustain. So that's why populations were not growing that rapidly. They weren't growing at all. The food was a limiting factor. But for the most part, people were not starving. So laziness is a normal evolutionary mechanism to preserve resources in your body, like fat, which is stored energy, but also your brain resources, because glucose in your brain is what powers your thoughts. When your brain does not have enough glucose, you can't even think. Every time you're solving a complex problem, your brain consumes glucose that is limited, which explains why some people don't even want to think. In fact, it's estimated that chess players burn about 800 calories per hour, which is just insane. It's about the same amount of energy you would spend cycling. So just think about it. Just by thinking, chess players burn the same amount of calories, the same amount of energy as cyclists who bike for an hour. That's just crazy. Just think about how much more movement your body produces while cycling compared to playing chess. However, all this energy expenditure comes from thinking a lot, solving complex cognitive problems. So for that reason, laziness truly doesn't have a limit. Even when somebody doesn't have to work, they would still prefer a robot to do all their chores. In fact, taken to the extreme, people would just prefer robots to do everything for them. People would just prefer to not move at all unless they like doing sports. It's like in this movie, WALL-E, if we look really far into the future of human race, humans are just tied to their chairs and robots take care of everything. In fact, robots move their bodies, make food. Everything is completely automated by robots. And it all stems from this extreme in the human psyche, which is laziness.